Poland was created at the end of the First World War and included large parts of what had been Germany. Importantly, the port city of Danzig, with an almost completely German population, was removed from Germany and made into a semi-autonomous city-state ruled by the League of Nations. This was done to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea, which would allow it to develop trade and a viable economy. Land to the west of Danzig was also granted to Poland and became known as the Polish Corridor. Both the corridor and the Free City of Danzig separated a large province of Germany, East Prussia, from the main body of the country. While many Germans were probably indifferent about the annexation of Austria or Czechoslovakia, neither of which had ever been a part of the German state before 1938 and 1939, they certainly were not indifferent about the possibility of reacquiring parts of Poland which had been part of Germany just 20 years previously. After successes in Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hitler's government was under pressure to obtain the Polish corridor and Danzig, if not more. As early as October 1938, just after the German occupation of the Sudeten, Germany requested negotiations with Poland regarding the building of rail and road links between the main part of Germany and East Prussia. If Poland agreed, Germany would agree to a 25-year non-aggression pact. Poland would be compensated with territory elsewhere. Poland and Germany had had relatively friendly relations since the implementation of the non-aggression agreement in 1934, and Germany allowed Poland to also help participate in the dismantling of Czechoslovakia. There were even suggestions that Poland and Germany should be allies within the Anti-Comintern Pact to oppose the Soviet Union. Germany now demanded that the League of Nations return Danzig to its control as well, something that required Poland's agreement and cooperation. Of all the German requests for territory, asking for access through the Polish corridor and control of Danzig was the most logical of its demands. Both had only 20 years before been part of Germany. Most of the residents in the corridor and Danzig were Germans. Danzig had its own locally elected government, and it too was dominated by the Nazi Party. Whether or not German demands were rational, the British and the French public, however, were outraged, having been led to believe that German territorial requests ended with the Munich Agreement. There were overwhelming demands that their government should not negotiate away Polish or League territory and confront Germany if required. Britain, afraid that an isolated France might make a diplomatic arrangement for its own security that would then isolate Britain, announced in February 1939 that Britain would support France militarily. This was the alliance that France had sought since the end of the First World War. Poland, a heavily armed state, very simply stated that it was not interested in negotiating away territory and eventually informed the League of Nations that if Germany attempted to annex Danzig, Poland would go to war to prevent this. Britain and France made a public verbal declaration that they would guarantee Poland's borders on the 31st of March, 1939. It was hoped that this would cause Germany to negotiate any changes in borders and not use military force. The declaration reinforced the decision by Poland's government not to negotiate, since it was through negotiation that both Austria and Czechoslovakia had lost their independence. Poland believed that the British and French guarantee made it highly unlikely that Germany would attack. There was an agreement that Poland and Britain would begin talks to create a formal military alliance along the same lines as the alliance between Poland and France. Britain and France were now in an ever-strengthening position with regard to armaments. It was in the autumn of 1939 that both countries, if working together, would surpass the production and stockpiles of weapons of Germany and be able to field large, well-equipped armies, fleets of ships, and thousands of aircraft. In April, Britain began conscripting soldiers as part of its military buildup. This dominance would mean that if Germany attacked Poland or France, it would have the option to respond militarily. It was with this in mind that Poland's borders were guaranteed. Britain now worked to create an anti-fascist network of alliances so any conflict between it and Germany would drag other countries into the conflict. Mutual assistance agreements were signed with Greece and Romania after Italy's invasion of Albania, and later with Turkey. Although they proclaimed an alliance with Poland, both Britain and France refused to send weapons or supplies as they argued that nothing could be spared during their own rearmament. When Poland asked for loans to buy weapons elsewhere, both nations stated that their own financial problems prevented this. Both Britain and France feared that arming Poland would either lead to Poland attacking Germany in a preemptive strike or provoke Germany into attacking Poland. Regardless of the reasons, failure to supply Poland with armaments meant that Poland was not as well prepared for war as it could have been. Formal military talks between Poland and Britain were only finalized on August 25, 1939. Britain and France finally made overtures to the Soviet Union. They presented the case that it was in the Soviet Union's best interest to help prevent a war between Germany and Poland. Britain and France pointed out that a war could be prevented if the Soviet Union would join their anti-German coalition, because surely Germany would pause if faced with war by Britain, France, Poland, and the Soviet Union. The only enticement that Britain and France had to offer was that they would agree to preserve the borders of Eastern Europe as they currently stood in mid-1939. From the British and French perspective, the Soviets should be thankful that they were now being made part of international diplomacy, and that they should appreciate that Britain and France would finally go to war against Germany, whose Nazi party opposed communism and was a long-term threat to the Soviet Union. The Soviets, however, had lost territory at the end of the First World War, from which various states had been created. These included Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a part of Romania. The Soviets believed that these should be returned to the Soviet Union at some point in the future. What Britain and France expected was for the Soviets to essentially endorse these old losses and to fight to preserve these smaller states. To further complicate these talks, Poland refused to allow any Soviet army to cross into its territory to fight Germany in the event of war, even if Germany had already invaded Poland. Poland was more concerned with the Soviets than with Germany. This meant that in case of any war, the Soviets would only be able to fight Germany in Poland if they received Polish permission. Since this permission was unlikely to be granted, the Soviets would be left to fight Germany only when Germans were close to the Soviet border or already in their territory. This seemed irrational and unfair, and was proof to the Soviets that they were only a tool to be used, not a real alliance partner. Negotiations were not helped by the British and French, who continued to send low-level diplomats instead of important officials who could make decisions. This insulted the Soviet leadership. Negotiations continued until Germany and the Soviets announced that they had come to a separate agreement. Hitler never believed that Britain and France would actually go to war over Poland. Part of this belief stemmed from his earlier success over the Sudeten crisis, and part was based in his thoughts on democratically elected governments. He continued to believe throughout the crisis that the citizens of those countries would oppose any military intervention, and that fear of war made these states fundamentally weak. In April, just weeks after the announced British and French guarantee of Poland, and at the time Britain began conscription, Hitler ordered Germany's army to prepare plans for the invasion of Poland. This plan was called Case White. These plans took into consideration only Poland's forces and not those of Britain and France. On the 28th of April, Germany withdrew from the Polish-German non-aggression pact. as another way to threaten Poland so that it would negotiate away its territory. Poland did not respond. Germany also responded to British and French pressure by creating a formal alliance with Italy. The Rome-Berlin Pact had only been a statement of mutual support. The Pact of Steel required each state to follow similar and closely coordinated foreign policies, support the other in war, make war plans together, work together economically, and coordinate their press, news, and other propaganda. Historians such as H.E.P. Taylor have successfully argued that the Pact of Steel was essentially meaningless. There was little coordination of foreign policy and no mutual war plans. There was practically no economic cooperation either. It may be that Germany never intended on this alliance amounting to much other than to increase temporary pressure on France, which shared a border with Italy, and to also pressure Britain. Italy's navy in the Mediterranean was large and could challenge British forces there. It may have been hoped that Britain and France, fearing a larger war, would force Poland to concede territory. Meanwhile, Germany began secret discussions with the Soviet Union. These talks essentially called for Germany and the Soviet Union not to fight each other, while allowing Germany to do whatever it wanted diplomatically and otherwise with parts of Europe that had not belonged to the former Russian Empire, which the Soviets hoped to reclaim. Secret parts of the agreement made it clear that parts of Poland that once belonged to Russia were now to be reabsorbed into the Soviet Union. This document, the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, commonly known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact, was signed on August 23, 1939, 1 week before Germany declared war on Poland on September 1st. Germany now had no fear of Soviet intervention on behalf of Poland and was convinced that Germany would now fight Poland without any outside interference. Throughout the crisis, Poland refused all negotiations. Britain and France, although working to prevent war by guaranteeing Poland's borders, hoped that Poland would grant Germany rail and road connections through the Polish corridor and allow Danzig to rejoin Germany. This would not only prevent an immediate war, but also remove obstacles to future conflict. They also felt that it would help Poland by removing hundreds of thousands of Germans who did not want to be a part of the country. Yet Poland refused, and both Britain and France pledged that Germany would not be allowed to use war to settle conflicts. Hitler had earlier ordered the military to create plans for Poland's invasion. On the 21st of August, he ordered the military to begin mobilization for implementation of Case White, the invasion plan. The date was set for August 26. The announcement of the Nazi-Soviet Pact on the 23rd of August removed any possibility of the Soviet Union intervening. The 26th of August invasion, however, was delayed. On the 25th of August, two separate issues emerged that caused Hitler to pause. These were Britain and Poland announced that they had signed a formal military alliance, replacing the earlier verbal promises of mutual support. And also Mussolini asked to be released from obligations imposed by the Pact of Steel made just months earlier. Mussolini had been a supporter of Germany, hoping that by attaching his country to a powerful ally, it too could benefit. It was hoped that a weakened, frightened France, for example, might grant Italy the island of Corsica and other southeastern French provinces. Perhaps Italy could also obtain French colonies. Yet it was clear that there was a real danger that Italy could be dragged into a war it was not prepared for and suddenly find itself facing the full might of Britain and France in Africa and the Mediterranean. Hitler granted Mussolini's request and the Pact of Steel was moderated so that Italy could play a supporting role, but not yet a military or economic one. On the 25th and 26th of August, Britain and France continued to work to prevent war. In talks with Britain's ambassador to Germany, Germany demanded that its military be allowed to move against Poland without interference. Germany pledged to respect the borders of the British Empire in return. This was an implicit threat to Britain and was immediately rejected. France's appeal for a negotiated settlement was also rejected. On the 28th of August, Britain issued a formal warning to Germany not to violate Poland's borders. To undermine the seriousness of the warning, all British ships in the Baltic and Mediterranean seas were ordered to leave those areas. The British government instituted emergency rationing of food and essential supplies. Hitler was still not convinced that Britain would go to war over Poland, and Germany's forces continued to move into position for the invasion. On the 29th of August, Germany made a final diplomatic gesture, perhaps to satisfy Britain and demonstrate that Hitler was reasonable to some degree. The offer was for the Polish government to send a representative with the authority to sign treaties to Berlin on the 30th of August. In this meeting, Poland would be required to agree that Danzig should be returned to German control, as well as the Polish corridor, a new demand, as earlier only transportation links through this land had been requested. Poland sent an ambassador to meet the German government on the 31st of August, but as he did not have the authority to sign treaties for his government, the meeting ended almost immediately. Germany's radio stations announced that Poland had rejected negotiations. On the 1st of September, a massive invasion of Poland began. 3 large German armies attacked from the north, the west, and south of the country, numbering over 1.5 million men, and a smaller Slovakian army entered from the south. Aircraft bombed military and civilian positions, disrupted roads and railways, destroyed bridges, and attacked factories. Thousands of civilians were killed within hours as German bomber aircraft attacked towns and cities. Danzig's Nazi government announced that it was now merging with Germany. Immediately, Britain and France called for an ending of hostilities. Italy joined too and called for a 5-power conference on September 2nd, in which Germany, Italy, Britain, France, and Poland would meet to resolve the crisis. Britain agreed to the meeting but insisted that Germany remove itself from Poland as a condition. Germany rejected this demand. On the 3rd of September, both France and Britain declared war on Germany. By all accounts, Hitler was shocked, as he never expected either country to come to the aid of Poland. The declaration of war meant that a localized war between Poland and Germany would now be a European war. He had gambled that neither great power would be willing to risk war and possible defeat over the borders of an Eastern European state. He lost. What would become the Second World War in Europe and North Africa had begun.